I think one of the things that we are struggling with in this part of the world, in Kenya, first, we subscribe to psychology, empirical psychology, and mostly the Jungian approach is not really practiced in this part of the world. And when I was presenting to the group that I presented to yesterday, I was like, this is an opportunity for deeper collaboration, because the students I've received from the Carl Jung Institute who have come to practice here, when I assessed their work through the lenses of the students or the clients they have seen, it is one of the approaches that is really loved. It has created deep growth in the clients that have referred to the students coming from the Jungian perspective. And it's something that I would really wish that we have a stronger collaboration, that we can be able to come and share experiences across, even organizing other events together, so that this approach can be alive in this part of the world. And one of the things that we are looking at, I've talked about being an advocate of decolonization of psychology. Even this psychology, the empirical psychology that we practice here, it is not really based on the culture of the people that it is serving. Most theories that we have are actually developed from other regions, and then they are taught as foreign concepts here. And sometimes I do teaching of psychology and also practicing, and I struggle a lot sometimes bringing concepts, integrating concepts that are foreign to clientele that is local. Some of the things we are supposed to do to create healing, they don't resonate with the local populations. And I always share one experience that I have had. I work with grief a lot. My research and practice rotates around grief and loss. And one of the ways that we have been working with grieving patients is when people are presenting with what we call unfinished business. And so we have these techniques of sitting together with a patient, and if the patient is having unfinished business with the dead person, so the patient talks to the deceased person, but we use a technique called empty chair, where in the therapy room, a patient is speaking to an empty chair and talking to the chair as if you are talking to the deceased person. But when I come to this approach, I have gone to my own community, which is an indigenous community, and I have tried to apply this technique when I'm dealing with the indigenous community. And the members of this community do not resonate well with this approach. They resist talking to an empty chair, because in our community, people relate to people. People don't relate to objects. And when we bring a chair in the therapy room, an empty chair, this community is finding it strange. But when I've studied this community, one of the reading lists that I'll give you is one of the papers that I've written on when I'm studying traditional mourning rituals from this community. When I interact with this community, I find in this community, they believe in speaking to the dead. So if someone has unfinished business with the dead, they would rather go to the grave and have a conversation. Of course, the dead is not speaking back, but when the person speaks, they believe the dead is hearing. And when I've gone to that community and abandoned what is imposed on the psychological training here of empty chair, and start to adopt what the community loves doing, what the community identifies with, I find a lot the process of integration and healing happening faster than these approaches that are coming from elsewhere. And again, we look at our ethics in the practice of psychology here. We find a lot of emphasis on the biomedical approach. Most the mental health field is run by the biomedical model, and so trying to come from the indigenous perspective, traditional perspective, it is a fight that we are making, but we are making small steps as we move forward, because the evidence-based brigade always talks about evidence-based and looking at indigenous practices as not evidence-based. But we are looking at them as some of the practices that have been done for thousands of years. The fact that maybe they have not been written doesn't make them not valid. And so that is the space that I'm working in, and I'm hoping to have a very deep conversation in the day. When I look at the composition of our class today, I think I've picked Jungian analysts, I've picked historians, I've picked anthropologists, and this is really, it raises a good question that I've always presented in my talks. The way we teach psychology in this part of the world, it is taught as a standalone discipline that people only understand psychology and they go out to treat with the knowledge of psychology alone. And for the times that I've practiced and researched, I'm finding this could be reducing the human being to a very small fragment if we only choose to understand the human being from a psychological perspective. But in my research on traditional practices, I've interacted with anthropologists, I've interacted with sociologists, historians, and when I bring the historical knowledge, when I bring the anthropological knowledge and sociological knowledge to work together with psychological knowledge in understanding my clients, this is the richest experience that I've ever had. So I would, as we move on, I would say, as psychologists, we need to read beyond psychology. We need to see how does an anthropologist view this particular disease? How would an anthropologist view this particular presentation that a client is presenting? What would be the view of a sociologist, and what would be the view of even a theologian? When we integrate our field together with other fields like this, I think it will give us great understanding of the clients, and we'll be able to improve the treatment process. So I want to then move to the first part of my lecture. And in this part, I want just to bring up the key concepts that I will be using in this presentation. And so the first concept is civilization, because our topic, we are looking at how has imposed civilization affected people in terms of transgenerational trauma. And so as I look at this topic, I'm looking at what is civilization? Because when I move around the world in different cultures, you'll hear people say, this society is not civilized, the other one is civilized. These people are not civilized, these are uncivilized. So the question that I keep asking myself is, what constitutes a civilization? When can we say that a group is civilized and a group is not civilized? And as we look at this, we look back in history also. How did the process of imposing civilization begin? It then tells us, for me to impose my civilization on you, there is a way I'm viewing your civilization. So if we begin by first looking at what is civilization, then we look at, should we impose our civilization on others? Are there people who are not civilized? And so one of the things that I looked at when I'm defining or trying to conceptualize a civilization, usually in any civilization, you'll find social stratification, societies that are organized in hierarchical structures. There are distinct classes of people, distinct groups in these particular societies. Any society that is civilized would bring up this aspect. There is some organization that can be seen around this society. Then this becomes one of the markers of civilization. And the other aspect is on the complex institutions that exist in these societies. When a society has institutions such as government, religious organization. And these institutions are helping to maintain order. They are helping to put the society together. Then we can say this society qualifies to be civilized. This is one of the other markers of a civilization. And then these societies also have economic systems that they engage in activities like trade, agriculture. They engage in specialization of labor. They engage in exchange of goods and services. Then this is again a marker of civilization. So as we look at civilization, reflect on civilization, it is not just a term. It comes up like a way of life. It comes up like a system that puts societies together. And then we have record keeping as another main thing that I picked on civilization. In societies that are civilized, mostly you'll notice they have a system of preservation of information. In some societies, it is through writing. In some societies, it is through oral literature. And these societies also have laws so that it puts the society together as an organized system. And this record keeping ensures continuity because records are kept for the next generations. Why things have to be kept in books is that the next generation can read. That's why stories are kept in oral literature, that the next generations can be told about. So a civilization actually envisions also continuity of that particular society. And then the other marker of civilization is religious and philosophical system. When we get to societies that are civilized, we'll notice they have belief systems that guide their moral values. So people don't just exist. There is a moral code that they subscribe to. Usually these moral codes are regulated by their religion, spirituality, philosophy. I think in one of the papers that I'm working on, we've been looking at taboos and how they regulate behavior. So how did indigenous communities use taboos, either to even preserve the environment, even to teach children and the next generation particular moral values. I've interacted with communities in my country where they kept the environment. They prohibited even cutting of certain trees. In my village, there are trees that we are not supposed to use as firewood. And you'll find a taboo around that. They'll tell you, even if this tree falls and it dries, you don't use it as firewood. If you use it as firewood for cooking, then you will hallucinate. They attach something like that. So nobody wants to use that tree for that purpose. But one of the things that I've found when I'm studying this kind of taboos, I find like for this particular one, for where people are prohibited from using certain plants, you'll go to the forest and find there are very few such kind of plants, very few. So when I look at it, I find this was a way of regulating extinction. So the community comes up with a set of rules and drafts it in form of taboos and says, to preserve our environment, this is going to be a taboo. This is a social norm around this particular aspect. So when we look at this, these are some of the things that show that a community is actually civilized. And then we want to look at things like cultural development. Civilized communities have art, they have literature, they have values, they have a belief system, and they even have their cultural knowledge. When a society has these markers that we are talking about, then we can sit down and reflect and say, yeah, this is what makes civilization. And I want to possibly pose a question like, with all this, would we look around the world? I've got experience from when we are presenting on our experiences around the world. I've found people from who have experienced Haiti, Brazil, Britain, South Africa, yeah, across different, others have done studies across different cultures. In looking at these lenses of civilization that I'm presenting here, would we say there is any society that is uncivilized? That's the first question that I want to pose across. And this is not a group activity, but just individual perception. Would we say there are societies that are not civilized? Or would we say there are societies that are more civilized based on this? So back to the class, let me get your reaction on this.
I was just thinking as you were going down the list, that was the thought I had, that this seems to be in every group of people. I was thinking back to studying the Incas in sixth grade, and they have all of those points that you made, all of those aspects.
Okay. Any other contribution? Yes.
Well,
So if there's,
I'm not a
proceed.
student. I'm not a student of civilization, but just looking at the list, it would seem that maybe writing and record keeping would be one that would be absent in some groups of people that in other aspects on the list are very civilized. But I'm keen for others' thoughts on that.
Okay.
I wholly agree with your perspective on looking at this from an interdisciplinary point of view and realizing that what as psychologists we might consider clinically is embedded broadly in sociocultural, religious, and other dimensions of our sense of how we construct our well-being, and that therefore that those things cannot be separated. So I appreciate your attempt to parse these things and bring them together.
Thank you so much. Any other person before I move on? Yeah, so if there's no other person, then I want to look at what constitutes historical trauma, because I'm just trying to get to the key terms that we are using in this presentation. And this term has been coined and explained differently, but in this context, we are looking at historical trauma as cumulative and emotional wounds that have been experienced by a group of people because of significant historical events. And some of the events that we normally look at, the list does not end with this, but these are some of the commonly looked at events that that propel historical trauma. Concepts such as colonization, slavery, genocide, or systemic oppression. And when we look at these concepts, it appears like they happened in the past. But again, I would say in the context of this lecture, we look at the past and present and even future. When we look at the world around, these things are not just history. They are still happening. They are still happening. And we would be asking one another, how are we shaping even the next generations? When we talk of historical trauma, because we are going back to understand historical trauma from slavery, which happens hundreds of years ago, we are saying there is still current slavery that is happening. And in my trauma class, when I teach my students, I normally ask them, what will be the generation that will be there 200 years after ours? What will they write about ours? Is there a way we are perpetuating what we are reading in history? Is there a way we are still colonizing without knowing? Is there a way we are still doing slavery, genocide? Are we doing systemic oppression without knowing? If I come back to our Kenyan context a bit, for the past 1 year, we've really had a very volatile political situation, and it's a complete shift in the politics as we've known. In the past, people always cumulatively looked at things from tribal angle. So you'll find even when political alliances are grouping, they would group, the big tribes would group together and say they will vote and produce a president. That's what has been happening. And then they dominate the small tribes. And today, the conversation has changed because there is a generational shift. We've had the Gen Z population, they challenged the government from 2 years ago. Just 2 days ago, we have had very bloody demonstration. They are demanding accountability. They are demanding good governance. They are demanding fairness. They are actually saying the future belongs to them. But the old leaders are still holding on power. They are still using suppressive methods. But there is a new wave of this generation that is coming up. And this generation is saying they are not they are tribeless. They are leaderless. They don't subscribe in the old way of doing things. So I'm still saying this is a generation that is struggling, which is telling me in my country, there is what I'm calling imposed civilization, which historically it came from other lands. Now, what I'm seeing now is it is still even going on from within the same oppressed communities. There are still elements of people within the same communities also posing as imposing themselves on other people. So when we talk of historical trauma, I would really love us to look at it as from the past, but just scanning around your societies and seeing what else is happening right now, that 200 years, the historians that will be there 200 years will write and actually document and say, we, this current generation, this is what we were doing that actually continued to traumatize people historically. And we've looked at this as a process that happens or manifests as a collective experience. Entire communities or populations who are affected by these events. So when we look at historical trauma, then it's not just affecting an individual. And that's where I stop again and look at now the way we teach psychology, the way we practice psychology, because in this part of the world, we tend a lot to focus on individual healing. We get clients, they come to our therapy rooms, we finish with them, they go back to the community. But here we are finding they are going back to a community that is also sick, a community that is wounded. So what happens when they go back there? Then it makes me continue asking, is this approach sufficient? Is even when I come to our experience in Kenya, where we are highly medicalized, medicalizing mental health, is that approach only explaining why these wounds are there? Can we heal these wounds just in our silos like that? Or there is a way we need to change the tact in terms of our practice? So that is historical trauma. And I want to look at then the other term, which we call transgenerational trauma. So this term, it talks about now transmission of effects of trauma from one generation to another. We've talked of historical trauma that is affecting people collectively. And now what carries this historical trauma through generations is now transgenerational trauma, because we are talking of slavery, and some of us never saw slavery, but our ancestors experienced slavery. But you find the effects of slavery continue to affect the descendants of those ancestors to a very large extent. So studies are also showing trauma continues. Trauma can continue to affect people who even never were there when the event was happening. And so when we look at the modern way of defining trauma, when we talk about trauma, many people would look at what event has happened, what life-threatening event has happened, especially when we go to the pathological models. Or was there a bomb blast that has happened that is causing trauma? But we are finding there are generations that they are not experiencing any violence now, but they are carrying marks of trauma from many generations ago. They are carrying this trauma, never having experienced any of the events that caused the trauma. So that's what we are focusing on as transgenerational trauma. So we see descendants of trauma survivors experiencing psychological and emotional consequences that was put on their ancestors. And studies also showing this is carried through transgenerational trauma. Now, the vehicle that transmits historical trauma across generation, this mechanism carries trauma through family narratives, behavioral patterns. There are ways a particular family keeps saying stories about the events that happened, how their ancestors were treated. These narratives shape the growing populations, and they are likely to carry this. When we go back to civilization, we talked about record keeping. So these stories are existing in terms of stories, and as these stories pass from one generation to the other, then you'll find children or the next generations carrying on these traumatic narratives. And then how do families respond? There are particular behavioral patterns in families, how when something happens, there is a way some families retaliate. I've been studying a concept called culture of honor. And culture of honor is one of the aspects in culture where we have communities that are very protective of their reputation. I think it is highly studied in the United States. So we have communities that place a lot of value on personal honor, personal value. So when their reputation is threatened, they retaliate maximally. Now, studies we've read on culture of honor indicates that globally, communities that are known to have very high value of honor, culture of honor, and they retaliate a lot when threatened, they are pastoralist communities, because their livelihoods depends on cattle. So they have evolved to know that the only way to survive is to fight back and protect their cattle. And then that tends to create a pattern of behavior around that particular community. In Kenya, we have such communities, and those are some of the very volatile areas in terms of violence. They do cattle rustling, they fight, they kill, just because of that. So it's a concept that is being studied. It would actually be a subset of what we are talking about. And then the transgenerational trauma also has been known to be carried through biological factors. Things like the stress response system, it tends to shape how people who have gone through this, it tends to shape how they react. Some people are more avoidant. Some people are more reactive when they are placed in a stress situation. All these narratives continue to change the way people pass this trait from one generation to the other. But again, I want us to stop and reflect on this, because when I've looked at across communities across the world, trying to understand genocide, trying to understand historical trauma, across the world, in Rwanda, where we had huge genocide in the 1990s, when you go to these places, they preserve the traumatic memory. They are genocide museums. They are monuments that are built to remind us about these events. And sometimes they say that when we look at the cycle of genocide, if genocide is forgotten, then it's likely to be repeated. But I want us to discuss a bit on this from our perspective as psychologists, as anthropologists, historians. Is creation of these memories healthy? Should we say if we need to forget the Rwandan genocide, because we are saying these narratives are carried through family narratives. So when the generations to come go view the skulls preserved in museums, does it help to heal the transgenerational trauma, or does it encourage? I don't know. Yeah, I always confronted by this question when I'm teaching this lesson to my students. What are your perspectives on this? Should we say we don't keep memory of this, or we say we should keep memory? What does it have? What space does it hold in the healing journey? So any person can go.
I kept thinking about it. I actually took this note before you asked this question, but I have a master's in arts administration and cultural policy. And it was in 2010. I studied in Chicago, but we went to South Africa to look specifically at this, how the apartheid is represented through museums and what this means for culture and how you can even represent something like that. And now I'm wishing we looked at it through this lens, through a more psychological lens, not just art. But there was one museum, and I can't remember which one it was, but you had to enter the museum through a way that they used to test if someone was black or not, and it was like, depending on your hair and the test of the pencil and all of these crazy things that were happening. But the museum forces you to walk through that and to experience that. And then depending which way you entered, you had a different kind of experience you meet in the end. So I don't really have an answer. I just wanted to talk about this because it's crazy to me thinking now that, we were looking more through this art lens, and I wish I had taken this class before going.
Mm.
But we went to Soweto, and we met with people whose families have been so affected by the apartheid. Obviously, it was still recent. I don't know. I want to open it up, I guess, to discussion, because these kinds of museums, like you're saying, and David, I know you have experience with this too. We had like short conversations about this in class
Yeah.
one day. But yeah, can we
Yeah,
talk a little bit about this?
thanks, Anna. I'll jump in there because thank you for introducing the topic that way, because I think it's very true. I mean, in my experience working with an organization called Freedom from Torture in the UK, and what you find is that when people have when those memories are re if they re-traumatize a person, then they generally will much prefer to be involved in the gardening program or the painting program or the poetry program, what we call anthropologically a third space, where, as with the homeless, you're not talking about homelessness, you're talking about art or something else, which doesn't carry that stigma and sense of guilt and pain and suffering. But eventually, and I think the literature on trauma narratives shows us quite clearly that once people can verbalize that or write it down or talk about it publicly, for example, in Rwanda, the Gonkasha courts, that it is cathartic to be able to do that. But I don't think that it's something that can be forced. And my mother used to say that, that she was a Jungian analyst, that to go back to the place where you feel security, well, that's, I think, fine for those of us who can reimagine a childhood place where we felt secure. But if going back there re-traumatizes, then it can have quite the opposite effect.
Okay, so that leaves it like it can vary across from one person to the other.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. Any other? Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understood the question, even though I sensed it was a good question or important question. I think there's a difference. It's important to differentiate between the individual and the collective. The role of memory is critical. Historical memory plays a very important role in international politics, actually, and in diplomacy. Sometimes it's not acknowledged, but it's quite a powerful force. And the role of memory is important because the denial of the crime constitutes an essential component of the crime. So to deny, for the denial of the genocide is in effect part of the process of genocide, or the completion of the process of genocide. And there's plenty of examples of this in comparative studies. I mean, even in modern times, you can see something on on the screen and they say, no, this is not happening. So it's kind of interesting. So I think it's important. That's I approach it from that particular angle, because the memory might be painful, but so can the denial. I mean, to deny that something has actually happened is one of the most fundamentally psychologically disturbing things, to question your very sense of reality of what has happened. It's quite jarring. Anyway, that's I'll pause there.
You
Thank
seem to have understood the question clearly, though you said you didn't. You really answered it perfectly. Yes, and thank you for that contribution. So I'll pick other contribution, then we'll be able to comment on that. Any other contribution?
Yeah, maybe I can contribute a bit too. It is a very important question, I think, and also to work for us with, because it's so deep in the collective unconscious, whether we talk about it or not. So coming from a culture where the Second World War is actually still very present in my family ties, and having worked and closely worked with war traumatized people. For example, one young man that I sort of took under my wings from Mali, who has been forced to move to Sierra Leone, where his father died of Ebola and so on. I see that there is a need for thoughtful capturing, let's put it that way, whether it's an oral tradition or in written tradition. But it's interesting that you put a written tradition in the civilization definition. What I find is that, for example, in Catholic sources, the write-ups are not always done by the same people that were mostly victimized. And so even in the Bible, you'll see that some stories are taken in that pass the critical eye of the ruler. And the ruler has been a part of the power construct. And therefore, to decide what goes into the public narrative has an effect on processing trauma. You see that with the Yazidis as well. So the female victims are now restoring some of what can still be restored after the traumatization of their whole civilization, but they can't do it in their communities always. And so how to do this, I think, is a very important question, and also to do it in a way that does justice to a culture that possibly doesn't have the same type of written narrative. And so I assume you have studied or worked even with Papadopoulos, who in the United Nations is capturing transgenerational trauma and working with this in war crimes. But I find him quite thoughtful in his definition that a village raises a child and how to work as a system with the transgenerational trauma. But this question is so important to look at from various angles. Thank you for even asking it.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you for that perspective. Just noting down, we'll be able to integrate with the rest. Any other view?
Yeah, I would like to add something here. I think it's partially related to what Garen has said. I'm originally from Russia, and I can see now that I don't really know how to put this, but I could see that the layers and the layers of transgenerational unresolved trauma is now being acted out. But the worst thing here is that it's covered by the kind of this memory, but it is not really memory that we are talking about here. It's some sort of other hypocritical kind of memory, which misuses the historical narrative, which misuses the, anything that is genuine. And I think it basically becomes kind of acting out of this transgenerational trauma, but it is so highly hypocritical that you just see how when people don't do anything with this, it becomes so extremely destructive. I don't know if it makes any sense what I said, but yeah, thanks.
Yes, actually resonating with the rest that denial can actually make it more explosive. That's what I'm picking from what you are sharing. Any other view?
Yeah, let me jump in on that, Michael here. Another example of what the last two speakers, Goran and Andres, spoke of in my experience is slavery and racism in the US. in America. And it's quite common to hear people say, well, you know, that was 200 or 300 years ago. That's not relevant now. And of course, you raised a point, Stephen, about whether slavery and colonization are still going on now, which I think they are. That's an important issue. And even if it were not as active or active now, there's still a transgenerational memory of that, incorporation of that, that's now being demonstrated biologically in epigenetics and quote unquote science that people have recognized for a long time. And so when Black Americans have anxiety, depression, high blood pressure compared to the white population, I think intellectually it seems very related to those traumas that have been carried for a couple hundred years, and it's still happening today, but the memory is important. And then another aspect of that we're discussing is the acknowledgement of that. And we're seeing right now in the US efforts by the white majority to wipe that away, to take away, to destroy the history and the written, the teaching of what's happened to Black Americans and other minority groups. And that is just a reinforcement and accentuation of the trauma for those people. And I think whether we take the time in this class or not, it clearly also begets a trauma upon the oppressor as well, which they then carry around and creates more violence in them. But just agreeing with a lot of the comments and bringing up the American experience as a reinforcement of this. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I can make it.
Just noted.
Hi, I
Yes,
wanted to
please.
make a comment because I think that we agree that denial is no. But I guess how to measure what institutions are doing and if it's productive or not. But I have this one example because of what Michael just brought up. I lived in New Orleans for a long time, but I had never visited a plantation nearby. I was always against visiting the plantations. But then I did some research and I ended up going for the first time in May. I found one whose educational or pedagogical theories were how to present this in a perspective where they don't romanticize and aggrandize all the beauty of the plantation and like the furniture and all of the stuff in the house, but they actually removed all the furniture from the house and lead you through the plantation through the perspective of the slaves who lived and worked there. And so I thought that was really helpful. So thinking about educational processes that can help, I guess, to express the memory in a particular way, unlike the apartheid museum that I thought was really rough and stuck with me, and this idea of you entering and separating. And I understand what they were trying to do with it, but I think it just like brings up the trauma again in this really violent way. And that was from someone coming from the US and Brazil. It was not someone who was living there. So I can't even imagine someone living there going through that process in the museum.
Yeah, thank you so much, especially from the art perspective, the way this is expressed, because yeah, we can really draw a lot from you from now the psychological field. Would expression only mean talking, or would it mean painting? Would it mean writing? Would it mean all those other forms of expression? And so, yeah, before I comment on what members have said, is anybody else with an addition? Yeah, what comes up is first we have talked about historical memory, which actually shapes international policy and politics. That was a very good point to note. And the other point that I picked is memory might be painful, but also denial is. So it's a matter of choosing which pain do we want to have. And I think when we step out a bit and look at other ways and try to look at the energy that is used even to keep denial, that would be really huge energy required, and that would really exert a lot of pressure on this individual. But I've picked quite a few other things. I think from Michael, when you talked about people saying now it's 300 years, so why should we even remember this? And brought up an aspect of acknowledging, because sometimes I look at how this trauma memory is even kept, because sometimes the memory is kept by the victims, but the perpetrators do not acknowledge. And I think if the memory is not shared between perpetrators and the victims, then it remains very painful for the group that is carrying it. But I've seen when painful memories are shared, when one person is coming up saying, I acknowledge, I did this, it wasn't right, though it doesn't erase it from the memory of the other person, but it seems to lighten the burden. So when we have these conversations and perpetrators are also coming up and yes, agreeing and saying, yeah, this was wrong, this would be very, very important. When I still stick on the American example that you've given and the acknowledgement, one resource I would want to draw to this class, I've used it some time back when discussing decolonization of psychology, and I have this historical aspect that I picked from the American Psychological Association. For many years, it was the other people, non-white people, were pushing and saying psychology does not represent their experiences. It does not, the developmental psychology either doesn't represent the way, it's not universal as presented. They brought up issues of discrimination that was perpetuated by psychology, by even psychometric assessments. And so for many years, there was denial from the side of the American Psychological Association. But I think in the last few years, they put up a task force that was told to investigate the history of APA and bring out different aspects in which APA as a psychology body promoted discrimination and this kind of discussion that we are having, trauma of the oppressed people. And they came up with a huge document documenting those historical injustices that were systematically performed within the field of psychology. And they wrote an apology in the year 2022. So there is an apology that is actually public on the APA website. And this apology now documents what the psychology did, what the different atrocities that were committed. And last semester, I teach a course called African Psychology in my university. So we did a project on this apology. So we were analyzing that apology with my students, critiquing it. And one of the things we look at the apology is written like apology to the people of color in the United States. So I think one of the critiques my students were raising is like, why is this apology only directed to the people in the United States? Yet the influence of APA is global. Wouldn't this be expanded to other communities? So I felt like, yeah, it's a good step, but there are people still feeling they haven't acknowledged that this has been a systemic problem even to the other parts of the world. And so when I look at this argument, I think very, very enriching. Acknowledging is quite good. And then I think when we talk of who writes history, that's something that I want to also talk about. Who writes history? And one aspect that we looked at here in the country, in Kenya, in the way history is written, when history is also left to be written by the oppressor, the history is also not accurate. So even the acknowledgement that we are talking about, the memory that we are talking about, if this memory is carried by the aggressor, this will be a problem. And we have had discussions around saying we even need rewriting of history. Now, the memory that we are talking about, sometimes you'll go and find this memory is actually, the narratives are told, they are narrated from the perspective of the oppressor. But I think one speaker has said, even going to the people now, the individuals who experienced it, and trying to see what is their memory. Because when as I finalized on commenting on this, last year I had a dissertation that I was examining. My student is student from Rwanda, so his dissertation title is he's researching on the genocide against the Tutsi. That was the title. So the dissertation committee had a problem with that title. Like, genocide was not just committed against the Tutsi, even the other community people died. And we at our university, the dissertation committee asked the student to reward and not use genocide against the Tutsi, because it is kind of denial that the other community also experienced death. When the student went to Rwanda to look for research permit, the government rejected, like they have to use the words genocide against the Tutsi. So the student conducts research there. When he comes back to Kenya for final defense, we still rejected. We cannot use the word genocide against the Tutsi. So when I look at that argument, it's power play. Who is writing the history? When the government is left to write the history, it is even writing history, denying, continuing the narrative of denial. But when the victims are allowed to write their history, then the denial will not be perpetuated. So those are just questions to reflect upon as analysts as we move forward. So how do I work with people in such perspectives? We are seeing this is a debate even coming within the education system. So I'm trying to see if this student was told so by the government of Rwanda. So who writes the books of history in Rwanda? What are children being taught? Because it means there is a generation that is being taught this genocide only affected this community. Because the people who are in power now, they are members of that community. So maybe again, years to come, those who will, if another person from the community that was looked at as if it never went through that genocide, they'll also start rewriting books. So very many intricate things that we are talking about there. So I want to move to the next slide. If there is no other question on this, but if there is, I can take, then we can be able to move to the next slide. And John, you will be also be telling us the time left, because we'll have a break within. I normally find it hard to multitask, look at time and that. So John, you'll keep us going. But back to the class, any reaction, or we can move forward? Yes, so we can be able to move forward to the next slide. And yeah, what I look at here is a few case studies now from the world. And I'm very happy already case studies are emerging. People have already shared the different case studies. And then back to the, yes, I pick a few comments from the chat. The message on integration of skill approaches is critical and is vastly underutilized in the medical community. Very pleased to hear your thoughts on this. Yes, that's correct. I relate to what you are describing as epigenetics of trauma finally being recognized biologically, yet having been recognized for a long time by others, seeing things outside the empirical science. That's really great. So just a bit, I see. Yes. So I want to look at, back to the question, we talked about civilization. We defined civilization. So where we are, I want us to look at this question. Did then civilization exist before the imported or imposed civilization? So I'm now picking an indigenous community. It can be one of the indigenous community we study is the Sami people of Sweden. So these communities exist across the globe. They are not just a preserve of Africa or South America. They are across the globe, in Australia, Canada. So did civilization exist before the other civilization? And so we go back to the markers of civilization that we talked about. When I posed the question, and I want to give this case study, I'm only using this term for this class. It is it is already not a politically correct term. It stopped being used some time back for those who have studied history on Red Indians, but just for the purpose of this class to identify that, then it's not a term that is encouraged. When the invading visitors entered the areas that we are talking about, and even what happens now, in Kenya, for example, I have a community called the Maasai community. They live in community. They don't have title deeds. Their land is for the community. So they are nomadic. They graze. They can move for kilometers grazing, and then after some months, when another section is raining, they go back, graze there. But we have now them fighting with capitalistic system, because people are now getting their land, dividing and allocating title deeds and using it for development. So we are trying to look at this community. Is it civilized? So mostly in the country, people view that community as not civilized. Just because they don't have title deed, people think they are not civilized. Just because they don't wear suits and clothes like the rest, they still wear maybe animal skins and such. People think they are not civilized. But when we go back to the definition of civilization, the conceptualization of civilization, we begin to realize even the so-called uncivilized societies, they were civilized. It's only that their civilization was being looked at from the lenses of the invaders. So when the invader comes, and I looked at it as a defense mechanism, if I want to take your land, I must first label you as uncivilized, so that then it reduces my guilt of taking your property without buying it. So the aspect of classifying people as uncivilized in itself is already a problem with the perpetrator, because it's being used to minimize the thing that they are going to do. And we can all conclude together that there was no society that did not have civilization. So even when imposing of civilizations was happening, it was just a way of destroying already an existing civilization. Civilizations were happening and at different paces across the world, and the people were okay with that. So again, condensing this history of the Red Indians in one slide, it's really difficult. But because the class is time-bound, I only highlight a few major things, but I'll be inviting the class to read more about these communities, those who have not had time to look at the history of these populations. So some of these populations lived along the Mississippi River, northern United States, coastal regions of the present-day Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, plus many other regions within the United States. And so these people, they had a government. That was one of the markers of civilization. They had political organization among themselves. And they actually constituted many tribes. So they had organization amongst themselves. They had governments of different sub-tribes like Mohawk, Oneida, and Seneca. All these would negotiate alliances and form governments. So if I was to stop there and just look at them, were these people civilized? Automatically, we can see there are markers of civilization in this population. And when we look at their economy, they relied on advanced agriculture. They relied on irrigation. They did fishing. They did artwork. All these were economic activities. They weren't using the money system, but this is a system, and a recognized economic system within that particular population. They had rich spiritual traditions around nature, animals, and what they called the Great Spirit. So looking at their religious organization or spiritual identity, we can see there was no absence of religion before the visitors entered these lands. And they are known, in their culture, they are known for pottery, weaving, and rock art. That's how this culture looks like. In terms of record keeping, again, these people are known for rich oral tradition. They could preserve histories through myths, teachings, and passing them from one generation to the other. Even though possibly not really developed writing, but this was their system of keeping history. This was their system of keeping memory, community memory, moving from one generation to the other. So if I stopped there again and just looked at the Red Indians, then you really realize this is a very civilized society in their own eyes, and in our eyes as we look at now civilization from an outsider's perspective. But when you go to the invading people who invaded them, they would look at them as not civilized. And the lack of classification of these people as not civilized is because they were not like the ones who are invading. So the invaders would assume civilization would only be possible if the people they were visiting looked like them. And then another case study, I look at pre-colonial Africa. It's a huge community. So again, trying to put that together, we would fragment and also look at existing kingdoms within Africa before the colonial time. But Africa, looking at it as a full continent, right now with 56 countries or 54 countries, in the pre-colonial times, again, they were highly organized. They had kingdoms like Benin, Kingdom of Benin, a very old kingdom, Ashanti Empire, the Zulu Kingdom, then the Bele Kingdom, the Sokoto Caliphate. All these governments existed before the visitors arrived. And so looking at the economy again of the African indigenous communities, they had an advanced agricultural system, irrigation, fishing, and barter trade. And then religion, very religious society with beliefs around nature, animals, and supernatural powers. All this existed before the visitors who brought civilization in quotes. And looking at the culture, there was cultural diversity in terms of language, art, music, and all the aspects that talk about culture. And then what is their record keeping looking like? They had rich tradition, also preserved histories, myths, and teachings, and they passed knowledge also from generation to generation through this. The elders are like the libraries. They hold the knowledge of the community. When the young people stay with elders, they get to understand this knowledge from the elders, and this has been passed across generations for many years. So those are two case studies that I want us to look at. And at this point, I would want to check with John first on time, because now where I want to go is having laid the foundation, then we want to see how did arrival of civilization and advent of cultural genocide, a very key concept we are going to look at, the instruments that were used actually to perpetrate genocide, that then cultural genocide, not just killing people, but killing culture, destroying identity of people, and how it now culminates to what we are calling the historical trauma or transgenerational trauma. John, before we went, I was just clarifying on did civilization come or it was there? And I think the agreement that we are having is civilization was there. So this was just a misconception of the visitors, thinking that the people they found did not have civilization. Then this introduces us to what did the invading civilization do when they arrived. So seeing them not civilized, barbaric, or savages, so it led to now an organized cultural genocide. And this cultural genocide was done to now civilize the people that have already now been classified as uncivilized. And so this brings us to this important term, cultural genocide, which actually implies systemic destruction of cultural heritage, the identity and the practices of a particular group of people. Usually it happens to all groups of people, but mostly it has been seen to be perpetrated by a dominating group of people to a minority culture. And in the context of where we are, we look at this not now as invading, because even within the existing minority groups, even within those groups, you'll find there is always someone dominating another. So it's quite intricate. It's not just an invader now. It's quite something that is now existing in our societies. So when there is a deliberate move to trample and to make people abandon their culture in favor of another, in quotes, superior culture, then that is something that can be referred to as cultural genocide. And now when we travel back in time in history, we find this was a very major approach that was used to traumatize people historically. And so I will be looking now at how was this historical traumatization, how was it done? So I'm looking at the instruments of cultural genocide. So just highlighting through, I want it to be a less presenting and more discussion at the end session. And so one of the things, this was a major instrument for cultural genocide, is what I call missionization. It is where indigenous cultures came, and I don't know, I'm seeing some activity on my mic. Can I confirm that we are hearing me clearly? Okay, that's fine. Yes, so when the invading cultures came, one of the biggest instruments they used, and again, we go back to our definition of civilization, there was a concept of religion. So that is the first part that was attacked. In many native lands, the invading cultures always brought together with them their religion. They disregarded the existing religions and actually classified them as evil or idols. In Africa, we say, the historians tell us, colonization was preceded by missionaries. So there was a God in Africa, but then this God, when the missionaries came, they said they were coming to introduce God. So possibly they assumed either there was no God, or people did not know that God that was there. So they came to introduce this God. There's this common phrase in history that the flag followed the cross. We always study this in history, that where colonization penetrated, first the missionaries went ahead. They went first, destroyed people's religion, the spirituality, introduced a new religion. Then later on, the explorers, and like after explorers, we had missionaries. Then after that, then now those who came to take power and rule now followed. So we look at the missionaries' religion as very disruptive to the existing indigenous order. So the invading religion now was enforcing obedience. So they start bringing people with a culture of not questioning authority. People were taught not to resist even any master. People were told to obey their masters. And this was a road to now, when the masters would come, they would find a smooth road to dominate on these people whose culture is being now invaded. And as I say, this happens to date, where I would give an example of, even in Kenya here, I subscribe to the Christian faith. Even when we go to churches, they still teach obedience. It is a major thing. They're asking, you can't question the religious leader. You can't question authority. Children are taught to obey parents. So the concept of not questioning it was introduced that time and is still being perpetuated even up to this point. And now, when even in the school system here, the teacher is the power. The children are not supposed to ask questions that show like the teacher could be wrong. And what this now continues creating is a society of blind obedience, a society where nobody can question another. And that's actually cultural alienation. Someone now starting to believe fully the views of the oppressor. And so apart from religion, the other thing that has been used in cultural genocide is suppression of indigenous languages. And many invading cultures also taught their foreign languages to the locals. And they labeled the local languages as divisive. This is a debate I always have with schools in Kenya. We teach English and Swahili. Swahili a bit, it's a local language, but most schools insist children speak in English. So even the government trying to discourage local languages, saying they tend to fragment the nation. So we need one language, and that language has to be a foreign language so that it can unite people. But as I shared the experiences we've had in the country here, we've still not united with English being taught for the last 60 years after independence. So it possibly like, it's not just the language that unites. There are many other fabrics that need to be put in place. But when we check the history of domination, you'll always find the language of the people was fought. The ethnic identity, which is a smaller cultural identity, is viewed as a threat to national integration. This is another concept that we see. So governments are struggling to promote nationalism, to suppress people coalescing around their ethnic identities and being told, like in Kenya, there is a common saying, they say, we are Kenyans, we are not our tribes. Sometimes when I make my arguments in these presentations in the country, I tell people I belong to an ethnic community called the Luya. So I say I am a Luya first, then I'm a Kenyan. But the government says you are a Kenyan first, then you are your tribal identity. So this is a debate that continues to move on. Languages, of course, evolve. Languages can change without suppression, but I think it becomes bad when now people are forced to forget the language. But when languages are just left, people can intermarry, people can move across the world, and languages can change, evolve on their own. But how changing language was an oppressive tool is when it is suppressed, when children are not supposed to express themselves in an accent that resembles their language. Because in Kenya here, what happens when a child is expressing themselves and we get accent of their mother tongue or their ethnic language, they are actually shamed. People think they are not they are not intelligent. So sometimes language even being equated to intelligence. But when we pick culture is carried in a language. So if I'm destroying language, if I'm destroying the language as an identity of a people, then that amounts to actually losing part of the culture that really they have subscribed to for long. So that was the second tool for genocide against culture. And the other one is erasure of traditions and practices. And many indigenous people were prohibited from practicing their traditional practices, like ritual ceremonies that are essential to the group's identity. They are prohibited, and these were the force that really attacked this was the missionaries or the religion that now came in. It came in teaching like indigenous rituals are evil, traditional practices as evil. People should leave them and adopt the new ones that have been brought. So when people are taught to leave everything they used to do, their way of life, that actually erases their traditional identity. And that amounts to actually cultural genocide. We have issues with local names. Local names were discouraged. Natives were forced to adopt new names of the invading cultures in order to be baptized. This is still happening even now. In our country, I see many religions, they can't baptize a child who has two African names. you have to drop one name and pick another name, possibly a name that is in the Bible, so that then now the baptism can be complete. And there has been a debate like, what makes me Christian? Is it the name or my belief? One time I went to another country and they asked me, what is your Christian name? Then I told them my Christian name is Asatsa, and they told me, no, tell us your Christian name. So we were arguing like, why do you think my native name is not Christian? Why should the other name be Christian? And so this debate, but this is a debate that didn't just start now. It started long time ago, and it's still going on. And one thing I was also checking, why is the first name usually the foreign name? Because in my passport, they say first name. So the first name, they expect you write the foreign name. Then now you come and write your cultural name. So I kept questioning here, like, so why are we adopting the first name as the foreign name? Why not my cultural name to be the first name? So when we look at this, it was a systemic issue that was introduced just to suppress a culture and portray another culture to be superior. We have traditions such as naming ceremonies, funeral rites, circumcision, where cultural transmission used to happen. But these have been suppressed and they have continued to be enforced even now. So people are no longer participating in these things. They say, when I go to the religious circles here, they say these are worldly things. So people are discouraged, don't participate in those things. They are worldly things. So when someone dies, they say just bury the person and go on. The ceremonies that used to go around that we have proved that are really good for mental health. When people participate in funerals as a community, when people come together for vigils and do rituals together, it facilitates healing. But these are activities that have been attacked and they have not been replaced. So nobody replaces them. They attack and tell you, abandon this, but there is no replacement. And that's how we now start seeing communities that are really fractured. We have another tool that was used for cultural genocide. This is forced assimilation. And this is where people are forced to become like their masters. People are forced to drop their customs, but adopt the customs, the belief, and the lifestyle of the dominant culture. And this leads to the loss of their unique cultural identity. One key thing that we've found across literature, the use of boarding schools. Boarding schools were used to separate children from their parents so that they would be taught another culture. It was a tool of ensuring a generation is alienated from their original culture so that they can be taught a new culture, a new language, a new way of doing things. And it still happens now. But the way boarding schools were framed, it was like, when kids go to boarding schools, it will improve the academic performance. So parents always view it as a favor to help the children to perform better. But when you go to the design of this, it's like separate them from their culture so that at the end they will adopt a new culture. In most French colonies in West Africa, the policy of assimilation was really promoted, where people are supposed to be educated and they dress, speak, pray, live like the French who are colonizing them at that particular time. This was the policy that was being adopted there. In the present day, we still experience this a lot until the natives do not have pride in their own culture. In the country here, sometimes we discuss this aspect of body image. We have many young ladies who try to bleach themselves. They are black, but they try to bleach. They want to be light-skinned because they believe black skin is not beautiful. And when we look at that, it's not true, but this is what history has wrongly taught them, to believe that the way I look is not good. I have to bleach and look like different to lighten my skin, then this is beauty. This is the effect of actually long-term policies of assimilation and cultural genocide. Then the last part I look at on the tools of genocide, cultural genocides, displacement, relocation, and extermination. In history, when invaders arrived in different places, at some points they used to forcefully remove natives from lands, especially if these lands had minerals, if these lands were fertile. These lands were supposed to be vacated, a land that people have had historical attachment to for long. They were supposed to vacate and be put in reserves. In our country, they used to locate people, collect people and put them in a small community, either in a drought area or a desert area. Then the highlands that are fertile are left for the settlers to do farming and their economic activities. So this was used in many places across the world. And now, when there was any resistance, the resistance then was met with large-scale massacre. I just picked an example of a community in Namibia called the Herero, who were massacred in 1904 after resisting to be vacated from their original land to the German population that was invading that time. So this happened again across, if we go to the indigenous people across the world, displacement and massacre was a tool that was used. And the massacre never just was perpetrated only to the adults, but even children. The goal was like to exterminate a whole community. In the Red Indians populations, we've seen cases where measles was introduced deliberately, smallpox. People were given blankets infected with these germs for these sicknesses so that they would catch measles and die in large numbers. And when we read through history, we find quite a large number of the Red Indians were wiped out through such acts, massacres, but also introduction of diseases. Religious symbols and cultural monuments were destroyed so that nobody would ever say this was our land or this was our heritage. That has happened many places in history, and even today it still happens. It led to the loss of traditional knowledge. Practices that were vital for cultural continuity were lost. And this is how now domination then begins to reign, because the indigenous communities we are talking now, these are communities without a culture of their own. Their culture is stripped of them. They no longer have pride in who they are. They no longer have an identity. So if an identity is now sold, an identity is sold to them from the lenses of the perpetrator, then these people will buy that because their psyche is already fractured. It's already weakened. They don't have a ground to stand on because their culture has been stripped completely. And so as I go towards the end, I'm looking at where I started. I talked about psychology, this side of the world, where we practice with empirical psychology and such. And so there are diagnostic systems in the world. We look at why people behave the way they do. We tend to explain trauma. When I look even at the major diagnostic systems, they do not recognize collective trauma. If I go to the DSM-5, for example, they only recognize post-traumatic stress disorder and individualized trauma. So there is still even denial in that aspect, like from a scholarly angle. People still don't give a lot of weight to this historical trauma that affects a community collectively. And that's why we present on this, that it can help us as practitioners, as scholars, to begin to look at it, like how can we address this problem, because it's a problem. There is evidence of collective trauma, but mostly, even in treatment, we focus on in the individual, not on the collective manifestation. Of course, there is no time a community goes for treatment. It is an individual who goes for treatment. And then we need to ask ourselves now as practitioners, so what do we do? The community will never come to my therapy room. It's an individual who comes. Is there a way us, as analysts, we can get ways of getting to the community? How can we help communities to facilitate, to process this heavy collective trauma that we are talking about? This trauma continues now. I was just sharing This is a case I've shared in Kenya. The first community called Ogiek. Ogiek is a small community in Kenya. I think there are less than 1,000 people now in population. And they live, their lifestyle is in the forest. They live in the forest. They eat roots. They farm, they eat products from the forest, and they knew how to maintain the forest themselves because that's their livelihood. But some years back, the government removed them from the forest, saying they are preserving. The government wants to preserve the forest, and they have taken the matter to court. It went to the East African Court, and they were given the right to exist in that forest. But even up to now, they are still being interfered with. They are being forced to move out so that the forest can be preserved, or the trees can be felled and used for other things. So this is a traumatization that continues now, both within locally and even from without. And then we find many people also lack awareness of this form of trauma. And that's why it is able to continue. People don't know communities are sick. People don't know communities need healing from this kind of atrocities that have affected them for generations. Yes, and so in research currently, what has been reported across indigenous communities across the world, just a few studies that I checked with the indigenous communities, the Red Indians, usually they present with high drug use and addiction compared to other communities. This is something that has been replicated in other historically oppressed communities. High suicide rates, high depression and anxiety, high crime rates. We can talk about South Africa. It's really, the crime rate is very high, and we can be able to understand where they are coming from historically. How come this generation is this way? Because of the history of oppression that they have had. And ending violence. We see many parts of the world, there have been wars for years. People are never ending fighting. These are just examples of now how the outcomes of historical and transgenerational trauma continue to affect. And sometimes we look at how this is being resolved. I see a case in my country here. We are bordering Somalia. Somalia has been a volatile area. A lot of terrorist groups hide there. But this country had 3 colonial powers. They were ruled by 3 powers, and then after independence, they were forced to become a country. And they've never agreed. There are so many factions fighting. So some 10 years ago, they used to attack Kenya using, like, terrorist groups from that country used to attack Kenya. Now our government sent the army there. The army has been there for 10 years, but they have not suppressed the terror groups. And that's sometimes when I sit and ask myself, can military force address this violence? And it takes me back to where I started my presentation. Could we try to understand this violence now, not from a criminal or military perspective? Can we try to understand this violence from maybe a psychological perspective, maybe anthropological perspective? Could we give meaning to this? Could we help governments to see how sometimes this violence can be resolved? Because what we are seeing across the world, it is only governments are using force. In all this where violence has been, it is force that is attempting to be used, but it is never solving the problem. Could this be societies that are manifesting the impacts of historical trauma, that we could also come in and start giving other perspectives? How do we secure these areas? These other communities that have history of oppression have actually also been seen to present with low self-esteem, self-hatred, people who have no identity and abandoning their own identity to start picking on identity of others. Those are the things that we can see. And as I talk about this, then we can see we have moved from history. We are back now in our mental health practice room. These are things that we confront ourselves with in the therapy room. But you can see they have a root in history. They have a root in these atrocities that happened in the past. And that's what makes it very necessary for us to understand history of the society and history of the person, then we can be able to understand their experience. And I want to, the last part of the presentation is just to see how the Jung lenses view this, all this that we've talked about. How does this shape a person in the Jungian lenses? And I think we'll pick a group discussion from this one, but I just highlight a few things. I think we'll get deeper to that when we go to the group discussion. And when I looked at the Jungian perspective, then I looked at the collective unconscious versus the personal unconscious, because we are coming from a place where these experiences in history, in the therapy room, they have been treated as individual problems. But Jung talks about a collective memory, a collective consciousness. Would this then support that as a community went through this, these atrocities settled in their unconscious, the collective unconscious, that even now the members who are being born, this shapes their worldview, this shapes the identity of the group. We continue to draw from that collective memory of the community. And we can see this because it manifests in cultural rituals. Some rituals are very common or similar across different communities. Commemorations, practices that are aimed at honoring the past experiences. This is how these things are picked and maintained in the common memory. So we are starting to see from a Jungian perspective, it actually agrees that these atrocities do not just reside within the personal memory. They also are deposited in the unconscious memory. So they can actually continue to affect how the experiences of people and how different psychological aspects manifest. Some symbols and cultural practices are universal, which actually agrees that, like, they reflect experiences that are inherited and shared across cultures. When I present my work on ritual, sometimes I've presented in regions, and I presented in South Africa, and the South Africans tell me, these rituals you are saying in Kenya, they are also in South Africa. And I start to ask, how come they are also practiced in South Africa in an almost similar way, like in Kenya? And yet there was no school for learning. Would it be these communities are drawing this from a collective conscious somewhere? Would it the experiences that they have gone through tend to enter a collective space where people actually draw from? The other part is individuation. I think one of the presenters talked about the process of individuation. So we are seeing achieving of self-realization and awareness and true nature is highly compromised in these populations. That's why people are abandoning their own, they are not aware of who they are. They are not aware of their true nature. That's why they would even abandon and try to pick fragments of who they are supposed to be from other populations across the world. Many people in these populations are struggling with the sense of wholeness and authenticity. And this has been seen to manifest through internalization of inferiority and self-hatred. People view themselves as inferior, so they would always see, when they see visitors, they would see visitors as superior. They don't recognize the personal resources that they have. And sometimes I normally reflect this when I look at Africa. We have huge resources, but we are borrowing a lot of loans from everywhere because we have not realized we have wealth within. This wealth can be utilized. So this actually a sense of lack of individuation when we look at it from Jungian perspective. And the other part that I align this with from the Jungian perspective is cultural alienation, because he talks about individuals who abandon their culture being actually maladjusted. When individuals feel they are compelled to conform to external standards rather than their own identity, then that creates conflicts, and this now creates maladjustment. And that can tell us how now the cultural genocide was a very important instrument for the invading people. Because once you break the culture, then you simply own the person. You simply convert the person to what you want. So when someone has refused to let their culture go, possibly this person would resist manipulation for some time. And then finally, I looked at the archetypal influences And we would see, trying to get literature saying, oppression can create actually new archetypes. And we would see things like people who are revolutionary or the hero. These figures can symbolize fight against injustice and quest for liberation. So this is how now historical trauma can put a stamp on the archetypal experiences of people and shape people in a particular direction. Oppressed groups often will create myths that reflect their struggle and aspirations, and they can develop archetypes that resonate with their experiences, such as trickster, people who challenge the status quo and expose injustices. This can really be a product of the history that someone is coming from. I've been when I study history of liberation, I've tried to look at even what music was sung in that time. So I check South Africa, I check Jamaica. When I listen to their reggae music and even pick the content, it is music that is liberative. The music is talking of fighting for justice. And that's, you can see people who are coming from those zones, even what they sing, what they draw, what they express in art, it resonates with where they are coming from. Collective trauma, and sometimes also looking at resilience.